Good evening, Lachlan. Welcome to TwiceTold.
Hi, it's great to be with you.
The pleasure is all mine, Lachlan. So I'd like to start by introducing you to the concept behind TwiceTold. TwiceTold is essentially a conversation between an author and a reader, where we both revisit the book from our own unique perspectives. Me from the perspective of having read it, you from the perspective of having written it and revisiting it now. You may have had different ideas for this book when you thought about writing it, when you started to write it, when it went through editorial, but the book is essentially told or set in stone when it was printed for the first time. I read this book with some information, some misinformation, some biases, and formed some impressions, early impressions about it. And now that I'm here sitting across from a table with you, discussing this book and hoping to refresh these impressions and correct them wherever I'm wrong, this book comes back alive for me. I am reliving the reading experience. I hope that this conversation also offers an opportunity for you to refresh some moments when you were writing this book, perhaps revisit some chapters that you wanted to include in this book, but you couldn't.
Yeah, no, it's been several years since it came out, so I am very happy to kind of take this moment to revisit it.
Thank you so much. So, my first question is going to be, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and why did you choose to write this book?
Yeah, so my name's Lachlan McNamee. I'm a political scientist based at Monash University in Australia, and this book really came out of my PhD thesis, which I did at Stanford in political science. But really, it came out of much earlier puzzlement, I suppose, when I was a young, 19-year-old in China at university, learning Chinese, and I was having debates with my kind of Chinese friends about what was happening in Tibet and in Xinjiang and the efforts by the Chinese state to kind of populate those areas with Han Chinese, who are the kind of dominant ethnic group in China, which was displacing Tibetans and Uyghurs. And I would point to these articles about this and say, isn't it horrible what's going on in the periphery of the country? And my Chinese friends would turn the tables on me and say, well, what right do you have to criticize China when you yourself are a settler living in Australia? So um, in a way, this book kind of came out of that provocation, I suppose, from my interlocutors, my Chinese friends when I was a young um, student, thinking about precisely those questions. What does it mean to pair kind of settler colonialism in China with what happened in Australia? Because for me, it's certainly true that Australia was colonized by British settlers and Irish settlers, and I'm the descendant of some of them. But it's also untrue to say that Australia is continuing to kind of colonize frontier areas with settlers. Um, in the same way that kind of we see active settler projects happening in places like Xinjiang, when the state is trying to actively move people. Or the book really begins with Indonesia, which moved about 5 million people from its core islands to its outer islands over the late 20th century. So clearly, these are kind of ongoing or active or contemporary settler colonial movements in a way that historical population movements in Australia are not. And so I wanted for me that really raised two questions. The first is how are these kind of state-sponsored population movements in countries like China and Indonesia, in places like Xinjiang and West Papua, different and similar to kind of settler colonial projects that happened in the past in the 18th and 19th centuries in places like Australasia and North America and South America, and how are they different? And second, why is it that settler colonial states, the kind of canonical examples like Australia, did cease colonizing frontier areas over the 20th century? And when I looked into those questions, I really didn't find good answers for them in the literature. which was really has been the literature on settler colonialism has been really dominated by Patrick Wolf's, who his idea is that settler colonial states are driven by a logic of elimination, and so reading the history of Australian colonial history, he suggests that the Australian state has been kind of hardwired to try and eliminate Indigenous Australians through various means, and that this elimination imperative has been consistent since the kind of birth of the Australian colony. When I looked into the history of kind of Australia's colonization, though, I really didn't see that framework as being particularly useful. First, because at the very beginnings of Australia's colonization, there was a tension between the interests and the actions of settlers on the ground and really what the kind of colonial officials were trying to do and achieve. And this tension really just only grew as Australia kind of emerged as a state in the 20th century. And so, when I really look at Australia's attempts to colonize Papua New Guinea, which was a colony of Australia for about a century, with settlers, and this failed. And so the book really begins with the question, why did Australia fail to colonize Papua New Guinea, whereas Indonesia ended up colonizing West Papua with settlers? And so that's really where this book came from, the sense that, I think it would be productive to kind of think about and juxtapose settler colonialism in the global South with the global North, and doing so raises a number of questions, like why did global North countries, with the notable exception of Israel, cease colonizing frontier areas with settlers, and then second, what's driving settler colonialism in the global South today?
Understood. When you view it through the moral prism, settler colonialism starts to ask questions which may lead us nowhere. But before we get into the morality of it, let's discuss how does this movement function. So what are some imperatives for settler colonialism to succeed? Or rather, what do settler colonialist movements seek to find? What are they looking at? I understand the logic of elimination is one of the outcomes, but is that the primary goal for a settler colonial movement?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the problem with the literature on settler colonialism is that it often wasn't characterized by a particularly concrete definition. So I tried to really emphasize in the book that for settler colonialism is distinct from other types of colonialism because there are settlers, right? Because the state is actively trying to populate a frontier area and with new peoples displacing pre-existing inhabitants, and it's doing so coercively. And so for settler colonialism to exist or not exist really depends only on the existence of settlers. Everything else, the kind of the logic of elimination, the kind of the racial ideology that settlers have or the state has, the intentions of the colonial officials, is really neither necessary nor sufficient to characterize settler colonialism. The only thing that characterizes settler colonialism is settlers coercively moving into a frontier and displacing indigenous peoples. So that's really that's how when we can say settler colonialism exists and does not exist. And in the book I develop a framework that distinguishes kind of two types of settler colonialism. The first is what I call is settler-led colonization, and this is when settlers are actively moving into a frontier area, but without the express wish or intention of officials to do so. So they may be responding to, say, population pressure at home, like famine, or the existence of gold in a frontier area. And so then you have people moving into a frontier area. So this would be like the Californian gold rush, the Victorian gold rush, or the movement of Han Chinese to Taiwan in the 17th century. So in these colonization schemes, you really see officials seeking to harness or shape the movements of settlers, but really it's settlers who are moving into frontier areas of their own volition. And this is very different to what I call state-led colonization, where states are actively try, giving people free land or trying to move them into frontier territory through the inducement, through like material incentives, like you see, say, with the Chinese state in Xinjiang, which has given a lot of incentives for people, for Han Chinese to move there, or for Israel in the West Bank, which gives like subsidized mortgages for Jewish settlers, or indeed the Australian state in Papua New Guinea, which tried to draw free settlers by giving out free land. So that's in those state-led colonization schemes. Really, the state is the primary actor, and they're trying to draw people to a frontier. So those are the two main types of settler colonialism that I discussed in the book.
Understood. Now, what is the relationship between the state and its colonizers in a settler colonial movement? We've seen time and again, and case in point, the United States of America, that the state and the settlers don't often see each other eye to eye and might soon enough break apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's really the core move of the book is in response to the kind of settler colonial literature tends to conflate states and settlers and assume they're both acting, in conjunction with one another. And what I really try and do in the book is say, no, we have to think about kind of a triangle of actors. You have the state, like the officials in the metropole, who are trying to, say, extract tax and maintain control over frontier areas. And you have settlers on the ground who may be moving into frontier areas of their own volition, say attracted by gold or what they see as land that can be easily alienated. And then you have indigenous peoples who are seeking to kind of protect their lands from settlers. And so sometimes state and settler interests are aligned, but often they're not. And so really going back to the earliest days of, say, as you point out, the United States, prior to the American Revolution, the British state was actually restricting the movement of Americans west of the Appalachians because they were trying to prevent American settlers from conflicting with native peoples and native nations who were allied with the British. But the settlers were moving west anyway. And so that was really drawing the state into conflict. And so really the part of what was driving the American Revolution, the kind of Declaration of Independence, was a desire to kind of free for the settlers to be freed of the shackles, the legal shackles that were imposed by the British, preventing them from colonizing west of the Appalachians. So you see this kind of tension between what settlers want and what states want, really characterizing not just the United States, but also the colonization of my hometown of Victoria, which was done illegally. And so the first settlers to my hometown of Melbourne called it Melbourne because they named it after the then British Prime Minister, because they were trying to suggest that we're naming this city after you, this new city, in the hope that the Prime Minister wouldn't displace them because they were there illegally. So you really see settlers kind of pulling states into frontier areas, and often in cases of what I call settler-led colonization. So that's the first way that states and settlers can often conflict. And the second way they often come into conflict is after states grow wealthy. So in highly modernized states like Australia or the United States today, or much of Western Europe, most people live in cities, and most people want to live in cities. And so most of the migration movement you see is from people from rural areas to cities. And this really presents a difficulty for states if they want to try and colonize a frontier area. So say Australia has moved to try and colonize Papua New Guinea in the 20th century, or abortive attempts by the United States to colonize the southern Philippines with whites. In those cases, even when the states give out free land, they find that very few people actually want to become farmers and move to frontier areas. And so in this way, as states develop, actually the conflict with settlers becomes even greater, and because they face even greater difficulty incentivizing settlers to move to frontier areas, even when they want to. And so this is why I suggest in the book that modernization spells the end for settler colonialism, because as states grow wealthy, it becomes increasingly difficult for states to lure settlers to contested frontiers, and so that really spells the end for settler colonization. And so that is the reason why I find in the book that Australia ceased colonizing frontier areas. It wasn't because Australia's leaders suddenly became less committed to white supremacy in the 20th century or less or more benevolent to Indigenous peoples. It was because it simply became too costly and difficult to get white people to move to frontier areas. And so Australia ended up shifting and decolonizing Papua New Guinea.
Understood. Now, my next question is going to be about settler colonialism's primary purpose, which is profitability. So, how does a state determine profitability and how does it control its settlers? And in the event if a settler were to be murdered, either an individual or a community was slaughtered by indigenous people, how does a state determine whether it's appropriate for them to take punitive action, which means even more murder of those native inhabitants, or just let the matter be?
Yeah, and so this is really difficult for states in cases of settler-led colonization, where settlers are moving into a frontier area, but they're doing so illegally or against the wishes of colonial officials. Often that does spark conflict, as you said. A settler may be murdered by a native person, and suddenly there are demands on the parts of settlers to protect them, i.e., for police to go and essentially massacre indigenous peoples. And you see this dynamic occur again and again, and really characterize the kind of expansion of the American West and of the Australian colonial state too. And so you really see that states, are kind of torn between the suppose the you say the political pressure on the part of settlers to protect them, but also the great cost that kind of seeking to protect settlers on the frontier would impose upon the state. And so you see following cases like the genocide of the Herero in Namibia, which was a colony then called Southwest Africa of the Germans. You saw the German colonial state then, after that genocide, restrict the settlers within a particular area because they essentially said, "We're not going to protect you if you move beyond that area because previous attempts to restrict you have led to this huge conflict, and we can't afford to continuously have these kind of wars on the frontier." And so they restricted the movements of settlers. And so they're kind of dynamic again. Sometimes colonial officials decide one thing, sometimes they decide another. But what I suggest in the book is that often colonial officials are engaged in kind of a strategic fatalism. They will see what's happening on the ground, allow settlers to essentially murder native peoples, turn a blind eye, and then post hoc incorporate that kind of cleared land into the state. Whereas in cases where states are the kind of state-led colonization, their states really do try and weigh up, what is the cost of moving one person to a frontier, and how does that relate to the kind of resources that might exist in that frontier area. So, for instance, I discussed like various commissions in settler colonial projects, like the Australian Commission on Papua New Guinea after World War II, which sought to basically calculate, what is the cost of all the money that would be needed to expend Papua New Guinea on housing, on hospitals, on roads, to get white people to move there. And they found that it was basically a cost of $1 million per settler. So to get 300,000 people to move there would cost like $300 billion, which was essentially a non-starter for the Australian state. That kind of huge cost basically made settler colonialism non-viable for the Australian state. So that's really why, as I said before, modernization spells the end for colonization, because it just becomes increasingly costly for states to lure people to frontier areas because everyone wants to move to major cities.
Understood. I've seen across history that settler colonial movements have tended to be either not profitable or ended up destabilizing governments. Case in point, the British East India Company, whose idea of aggressive expansion got so out of hand that you ended up covering more ground than you could effectively administer and leading to violent reprisals from the native people via the 1857 Indian Mutiny and even more murderous reprisals that followed. So, my question is, why is it that states choose settler colonization versus straightforward colonization, where you co-opt indigenous people into your fold, much like the Roman Empire? You have a simple method of extracting taxes, just a flat fee from every inhabitant living there, and perhaps work a way out where even the native inhabitants benefit from your presence. So, profitability being paramount, if that was the sole purpose of this exercise, wouldn't this be much more meaningful that you're not murdering anyone, sociologically, which is good, and you're also getting the wealth that you wanted?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and that is why, for the most part, states do throughout history have just extracted from peoples in the frontier. They haven't actively tried to colonize or shift people around. Really, the two exceptions are, first, the cases where settlers move into frontier areas of their own volition, and then that kind of creates that dynamic I described before, where states are kind of have to decide whether they're going to side with the settlers or the indigenous peoples in the frontier. And even if they may try and prevent settlers from moving into frontier areas, like the British state tried to do in America, or the Australian state tried to do in Victoria, or as you mentioned, the British state tried to do in India. Sometimes people move there anyway, and then it creates this conflict, and the state has to kind of step in. So that's the first case. The second case is where states don't just aren't just happy to extract and people in the frontiers is during war. So um, often these cases where states actively try to move people into frontier areas take place during war, when native peoples in the frontier, their loyalties are seen as essentially suspect. So native peoples might have a shared ethnicity with a kind of competitor state, or they may be actively engaged in insurgency. So in those cases, states don't really know who's loyal to them and who's not, and so that's why you see, Machiavelli, actually advised this, that in those situations it's just better to populate a frontier with people who are seen as your own, and who are presumptively loyal. And really, that like one example of this, would be like, say, the British state rule over Ireland, which, for hundreds of years after Britain annexed Ireland, essentially was a a um, just a normal, just a kind of standard type of colonial extraction. But really, the British state switched in the early 1600s to actively trying to colonize Ireland with Protestant settlers, because it was happening in the context of major Protestant Catholic conflicts in Europe. The Irish were overwhelmingly Catholic, and they were seen to be allied with Catholic Spain. So anyone who was Catholic was seen to be disloyal, and so kind of populating Ireland with Protestants was seen to be kind of a short-term expedient tool for quickly securing control over that area, because they feared that Ireland would basically be a stepping stone to a Spanish invasion to England. And they weren't wrong with the Spanish Armada essentially trying to do that. So in those cases, and you see that to the current day, whether in places like Kashmir or Xinjiang, or indeed in Palestine, you really see states regarding frontier peoples who may have a different ethnicity, different religion, as suspect and allied with a hostile foreign state. And in those situations, you see states rarely happy to just maintain some kind of relaxed control over a frontier. That they instead are much more coercive, and often turn to strategies like settler colonialism, like moving people in, expelling people out to secure control over that area.
Understood. Now, my next question is going to be about settler colonial movements. Are these stemming out primarily from territorial insecurity?
Well, I mean, I suppose in um, not in cases of settler-led colonization, because really that's driven by the interests of individuals on the ground who want land, who want gold, who might be trying to escape drought. Um, that's not really a kind of territorial insecurity logic. That's just the interest of settlers. With territorial insecurity does explain cases like the Irish case I just pointed to. So where you see states engage in kind of interstate wars, often that really does drive a state's decision to kind of seek to expel the peoples and populate it with loyal peoples. That's really where you could say territorial insecurity in that sense does is often the driver of kind of state-led colonization.
Understood. If all of us humans derive our origin from Africa, and given that we then migrated from Africa into different parts of the world, and subsequent migrations of people have also happened once tribal identities were formed. So, does that mean that inherently we've all been settler colonial, regardless of a state backing us?
Yeah, sometimes people say this, and I suppose my response is that the well, it's two things. The first is that settlers are different to migrants because um, settlers because migration is both can be consensual and non-consensual, but settler colonialism is always non-consensual. It's the non-consensual movement of a people into an area. So it hasn't been like kind of visas or hasn't been kind of these people aren't being welcomed by the pre-existing population. There's coercion involved. People are being displaced and new people are coming in and their lands are being taken. So in that sense, like although you're right that like that we're all kind of migrants in some sense from Africa. Um, we're not all settlers. For there to be a settler, there has to be coercion and there has to be a pre-existing population. So this idea of settler and indigenous, they're kind of the two opposites. There's like black and white. These are relational identities. If there's a settler, there has to be an indigenous person. There has to be someone who was there before, and then someone who came after, and someone who displaced the person who was there before. So what that means is that you know often the person who or the group that is an indigenous group in one context can be a settler in another. And Edward Said made this point. With the case of with Palestine, which is the proverbial people of exile who were Jewish people, became made exiles of the Palestinians. And this is true of my own family's history too. Like my the last name McNamee comes from Northern Ireland. It's a kind of Catholic name, and the Catholics in Northern Ireland are kind of the, the indigenous population who were there before the Protestant settlers came. So in Northern Ireland, I'm kind of like an indigenous person, but in Australia, I'm a settler because when my ancestors moved to Australia, they moved as part of a project of kind of displacement of the indigenous population there. So people switch and groups switch depending on the relationship to power and context. So I kind of I don't agree with the idea that kind of we're all settlers because or that we're all indigenous because these concepts are really contextual, and you really have to understand in a particular historical place, like who was here before, who was after, and um, was that demographic change driven by coercion? And if so, you can legitimately speak of settlers, but if there was no one there before, like if we're talking about where did people in Iceland come from, that kind of thing, like then I think it would be missing the point to call them settlers because there was no one there before. They were just migrants.
I agree with the part about migrants. Once the initial wave of migrants had come in, but subsequent waves of migration that came later, once tribal identities were formed, either because they were pushed out due to natural causes, droughts, famines, or natural calamities, or state-led interventions. For example, the conquest of the Arabs in Persia, leading to settlement of an Arabic-speaking population in Persia, or, for example, in medieval India, people of Iranian origin migrating toward India for in pursuit of fame and fortune. So they coming in and with their own pre-existing cultures and language settling into this new space, would that also not be construed as some form of settler colonialism?
Yeah, look, I suppose the I think the tension that you're pointing to is that, in a context like India today, um, or indeed much of like Europe, it always seems somewhat arbitrary to ask like who is a settler and who's an indigenous person, because these population movements happen so long ago, and often the asking these claims that say the people from Persia or the people in Kashmir today or are kind of recent movements is often a prelude to saying we should expel them, or like that they maybe like you could point to say like the expulsion of the Indian community in Uganda, like the concept of indigeneity is often used to as a basis for kind of expulsion and violence, right? And that's kind of at the core of a lot of nationalistic movements in the 20th century. This claim that like indigeneity, that we were first and you came later, and even if it was centuries ago, you're still illegitimate and you should go back to where you came from. That's often been at the core of a lot of violence, and it still is today. You see it in like places like Kashmir, um, where the claim that like the Muslims there they came after the Hindus, and therefore like expelling them or like repopulating that area with Hindus is righting a historical wrong. Or in Palestine, you see the claim that like because of biblical writings, Jewish people have the right to live anywhere in between the river and the sea, and um, that they're because they're the original peoples, that legitimates all the violence that's happening. I think we should just like really like critique that, or just question that, or maybe just resist that, because this idea of like indigenous settlers, I mean, it's something we do see quite a lot around the world, and I do think it is quite arbitrary often to say like who's indigenous and who's a settler. It should never be used as a kind of basis for reiterating a new settler colonial project, like expelling people who are there and repopulating the area. I think that's kind of where I kind of think that discourse goes wrong. Um, so I share with you that kind of skepticism, I suppose. And I can see why it might be tempting to just say, well, we're all kind of settlers in some sense. But nonetheless, I think we shouldn't. We should just insist that you know people who have been people who are born and have been in a place for a long time um, have the right to be there too. And so we should never use indigeneity as a basis for expulsion or resettling a place, because that is just reproducing settler colonialism in a new form.
Absolutely. One thing that nationalist movements claim or seek to enforce is this homogeneity or this fiction of purity. All cultures are inherently mixtures. We are influenced by cultures of our own, whatever that are might be our previous background. There within each and every human being there will be genetic traces of at least two to three different races of people, not to mention the cultural overlays which are so many and so intricate, it's impossible to now unweave and come out of it. So this whole idea of homogeneity itself is a work of fiction, and it should be branded as this unwanted, unnecessary, violent fiction which breeds resentment. And rather,
Yeah.
whoever has settled here has settled. Now, what we're looking to enforce is peaceful coexistence with the people and the ecosystem, vis-a-vis transplanting a new idea or ideology onto a land which possibly cannot. For example, Israel trying to turn the Palestinian landscape green by forcibly by tapping into underground water reservoirs and forcing agriculture over there on a landscape which never traditionally had it.
Mm.
Now that leads me to my next question about a new form of settler colonialism. Do you think that this movement is now changing with data centers coming into third world countries, extracting water, sitting on land, also ensuring that the local population does not have a part in it, and the data centers tend to serve their colonial masters elsewhere, perhaps in the developed world?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I just wouldn't. I think that's a very real phenomenon, and I think it's important. I just wouldn't call it settler colonialism, just because there's no settlers, right? It's kind of going back to that, I suppose, initial move in the book, which is really to insist that we can't just say that everything's settler colonialism. Settler colonialism requires settlers to be settler colonialism, whereas what you're talking about is kind of server colonialism, which I think is a cool concept. Um, and these kind of data mining enclaves are what frontier exploitation looks like after this kind of demographic transition, after the movement of people to cities. Frontiers kind of seen as these empty spaces, though never mind the people who are there. And then you really see capital moving where people won't. Um, so that is like a kind of this new type of power relationship. You could call it a new type of colonialism. I just don't think it's kind of settler colonialism.
Understood. Now, are all settler colonial movements developed and sustained only through violence? What happens when that violence is no longer sustainable?
Yeah, I think in some core sense, like all states are upheld by violence, or the threat of violence, that kind of idea. Like I'm very much informed by Weber here, talks about states being the actor in society with like kind of monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. So in some sense, yes, like of course all settler colonies are upheld by violence, um, but I think going back to the typology in the book, I suppose the deeper argument would be to say that settler colonies are upheld or exist when there's an alignment of interest between states and settlers, and when that alignment holds, you really can see huge population movements that completely upend the nature of society in frontier areas. But really, when you don't have that kind of alignment of interest between settlers and states, then you really do see kind of something else emerging. So this is what I kind of suggest in the book, that you know one of the reasons why Australia ended up peacefully decolonizing Papua New Guinea, it became a kind of willing decolonizer there. Actually, the prime minister at the time, Gough Whitlam, was extremely proud to be, the Australian prime minister who handed over the keys to Papua New Guinea to the native peoples. How did that happen? Like, how did a kind of state so committed to settler colonialism become a kind of willing decolonizer? And so I really, in the book, I point to how it was because the states and settlers, there were no settlers anymore. The interests of the settlers, or just white Australians, had changed so dramatically that the state could no longer rely on them to be a partner in any kind of frontier project. And so its interests changed too. And facing demands for citizenship on the part of Indigenous Papuans, Australia quickly pivoted and instead of granting all the Indigenous, the native peoples in Papua New Guinea citizenship, which would have itself been extremely costly, Australia instead pivoted to do the much easier thing in its view, which was to grant Papua New Guinea independence. And so you kind of see that shift to decolonization coming from the breaking of alignment between states and settlers. And in the book, the really core argument is that that breaking of alignment happens with economic development. And so with the drying up of settlers really is what leads to decolonization.
Understood. My last question would be about the future of settler colonialism now that Israel's violence has been live streamed and broadcast to the world. Now, do you foresee that this movement will be forced to become less violent? Will it have to change its methods now going into the future for any future project to be morally sanctioned?
Yeah, look, I so when I was writing this book, um, it was obviously written before October 7th and everything that's happened since, basically the as you said, the ongoing just killing project that everyone's seen. Um, so what does that mean, I think, for the for the book? I kind of want to take a step back. So, in the previous question, I talked about how as Australia grew wealthier, it actually shifted to kind of becoming a willing decolonizer. Um, and that's something that when I was writing the book was actually true of Israel too. So Israel prior to 2005 made kind of an effort for about 30 years to encourage people to settle in Gaza, but really struggled to get Jewish settlers to move there. It was very far from the rest of Israel, and most settlers wanted to be in a place that was commuting distance to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or a major urban center. And so, we really saw the Israeli state do a very similar thing to the Australian state, which was that in around 2005, it was facing a kind of dilemma. What does it do with all the 2 million like Arabs who are neither kind of really citizens of Israel, but nor are they kind of a foreign, entirely foreign. They're kind of subjects. Like, do you grant them citizenship or do you kind of allow them to have an independent state? And the Israeli state moved to do what it kind of what it called a disengagement with Gaza. It did move to kind of grant a much greater deal of autonomy to Gaza's government. That very much paralleled what Australia did in Papua New Guinea. And I suspected, or I hypothesized, that China would do a similar thing in Xinjiang. That after what I show in the book is China really tried and it was failing to get Han Chinese to move to Xinjiang, or to southern Xinjiang in particular. And I hypothesized that this would create a kind of dilemma for the Chinese state, and that eventually you would have to move to kind of either grant the Uyghurs there like genuine autonomy, or it would have to give them independence. Now, in both Xinjiang and in Gaza, you haven't seen that happen, and so one thing that I've kind of learned after the book has come out, or one thing I recognize, is that I was perhaps overly optimistic about um, the 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 willingness, I suppose, of states to engage in the kind of ruthlessness that states can resort to maintain control over a frontier area. So we've really seen two kind of historic violent episodes since I wrote the book. The first is, China's mass incarceration project, where almost like the 1.1 in 20 Uyghurs were incarcerated. And second, in um, in Israel, you've just seen this kind of collective punishment of Palestinians, this like indiscriminate bombing campaign. So in both cases, in the book, I really talk about how states have to make up these decisions, and when they're engaged, when they're trying to maintain control over a frontier, if there's a conflict there, as there was in Xinjiang or as there was in Gaza, after what happened on October 7th, what do states do? Um, I hypothesize, if they're unable to settle an area, then they're more likely to kind of grant it independence. But what I now believe is that they're also more likely to engage in, either in a type of genocide or forced assimilation, as we've seen in Xinjiang in Palestine. So this kind of desperation, I suppose, on the part of states to maintain control over an area, but don't know what to do with the population who are seen as all disloyal, but you can't settle that area. So what do you do? And you've seen, in the case of Xinjiang, kind of mass incarceration, forcible assimilation, separation of children from parents, and the kind of suppression of Uyghur identity. And then in Gaza, you've just seen similar levels of desperation on part of the Israeli state, and probably if Egypt had allowed, or a Western state had taken them in, very early on, I'm pretty sure the Israeli state would have just expelled all the Gazans from there. But there was no one really willing to accept them. So the Israeli state instead just engaged in this kind of indiscriminate bombing campaign, which really has no seeming endpoint. So I suppose in that sense, what I've learned is that this economic development does spell the end of settler colonialism, in the sense that it spells the end of kind of the attempts by states to move people into frontier areas like Gaza or Xinjiang. But it doesn't nearly spell the end of violence, or kind of, especially if states are committed to maintaining control over a frontier, then that just means without settlers, they will take it upon their hands themselves to essentially change the demography of that area through violence.
Understood. So, which means for a peaceful and sustainable future, decolonization is the only key.
Yeah, it again just goes back to the question I posed to my Chinese friends, or to what is so or to my Indian friends, like, what is so wrong about letting peoples in a frontier just determine their own future? If they want to be part of the state, that's okay. If they don't, it's okay too. We just need to let go of these nationalistic visions and obsessions with maintaining territorial integrity, and just let people who are there vote and decide their own future. And I think that would, as you said, be the far more peaceful way, and it's the way that is kind of least pursued, but holds the most promise.
I suppose the philosophical answer of holding sand in your hand is key here. If you try to close your fist, the sand will flow out between the cracks in your knuckles. But if you just let your hand open, as you said, let them determine their fate, their future, and more likely than not, they'd probably choose to stay. Of course, it'll be on their terms, but it'll be infinitely more peaceful for both parties involved.
Absolutely, that's it. With some guarantees about political and cultural autonomy, the situation would be very different. But it does involve political leadership and a great deal of vision, and it's just something that we lack.
Right, that's true. Thank you, Lachlan, for this conversation and for authoring this fantastic book, Settling for Less.
No, thanks. It's been a real pleasure.
Likewise, I enjoyed this conversation. Thank you now.
Thanks.
Have a great evening.
Thanks. You too.
Bye bye.